We are continuing our series through the Ten Commandments, and we've entitled this series 10 Steps to Freedom. And the reason we've entitled it that is because we tend to have this view of the Ten Commandments that they are restrictive, that they are meant to take the fun out of life, or whatever the stereotypes that we tend to have on the Ten Commandments. And really the Ten Commandments give us boundaries to show us how what loving God and loving one another looks like. And obviously, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection fulfills what the Ten Commandments were talking about, and obviously forgiveness of our sins and the opportunity to try again when we fail. But again, we want to get away from the Ten Commandments being these rules that God was making because he was in a bad mood someday. No, they are meant to equip us, to give us boundaries to do things that we are not able to do if we don't follow them. And so they really are a gift, and we want to look at it from that point of view. So we've asked Ed McCarroll to read Scripture this morning. So Ed, if you can make your way on up to the podium. And as he does so, if you are able, I'm going to ask you to please stand and face the center of the room. And we stand because we believe that these are the words of God. And so, Ed, whenever you are ready, if you can just read from Exodus 20 and Matthew 5.
Exodus 20:14 says, "Do not commit adultery." Matthew 5:27 says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart."
Thank you, Ed. You may be seated. Short and to the point. Pastor Brian and myself and Brian Phillips typically meet for prayer before services in the morning, and Pastor Brian said something that really resonated with me this morning. He said that the subject on adultery, on one level, is it's awkward because of the subject matter and the sensitivity of that, and yet on another level, it's absolutely essential and critical that we address this particular issue. And I am also sensitive that for some of you, this is going to not be a pleasant experience. This is going to be painful. It's going to bring up things that you'd rather not be brought up and that kind of stuff. And just be aware that I'm aware of that. And I have an appreciation for that. But I want us to start by asking the question, why is marriage special? Why does not committing adultery make the Ten Commandment list? What's so special and great about marriage that other relationships, that it gets its own little thing in the commandments? And what I want us to do to answer that question is take just a little trek to the prophet Hosea. And Hosea was a prophet during the divided kingdom in the Old Testament. And the Israelites had split into two kingdoms during the reigns of King David and King Solomon. If you're familiar with those two kings, there was one kingdom of Israel. And a little over 900 years before Jesus, the kingdom of Israel split into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And about 150, 175 years after the split, Hosea comes as a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. About 750, 775 years before Jesus. And shortly after his ministry concludes, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to another kingdom called Assyria, mainly because of their unfaithfulness to God. And Hosea, in the book of Hosea, basically, if I could give you a snapshot of what that prophet is about, is Hosea compares adultery to idolatry. Hosea, very beginning of Hosea 1, verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go and marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." And it's one of the strangest commandments in the Bible. Go marry an adulterous, unfaithful woman and have children with her, is what Hosea is told to do. And the point of the command is that that adulterous relationship is symbolic of Israel's idolatry. Hosea symbolizes God, and his adulterous wife symbolizes Israel's idolatry. And God talks about their idolatry in Hosea chapter 11, verses 1 to 4. When Israel was a child, God says, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms. But they did not realize that it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. And to them I was like one who lifts a little child to the cheek, and I bent down to feed them. And God is grieved because the people who he's loved and that he wanted to have this relationship with, I will be your God, you will be my people. And he has done all these things for them. And they just blow it off. And they worship other gods. Yeah, they were worshiping God. But in addition to worshiping God, they were worshiping other gods. And this symbolism that God compares that idolatry, he compares that to adultery. And that symbolism works because worship is a sacred relationship. I will be your God, you will be my people. That's a sacred relationship. Likewise, marriage, I will be your husband, you will be my wife, is a sacred relationship. And sacred relationships are exclusive. There is no room for a third party in a sacred relationship. Again, look at the very first command. You shall have no other gods before me. Well, what's up with the before me? Why don't you just say you shall have no other gods? Well, before me literally means to my face. Sounds a little bit like in my face. Interestingly enough, that same language, before me, you shall have no other gods before me, it's also used to describe what a husband does when he takes a second wife when his first wife is still alive. That's taking a wife before me. That would be the first wife. In other words, what God is saying, don't worship other gods while you are worshiping me. It almost sounds like God is saying, look, if you're going to worship other gods, then worship other gods. Don't worship me then. But it's got to be either me or them, not both. And while that may sound a little strange, think about what Joshua says. What does Joshua say at the end of towards the end of his life? He says this to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Choose. You want to have a sacred relationship, you must choose. You cannot have both. You want a sacred relationship or not? They're exclusive. And as followers of Christ, we are told, do not pollute the sacred by bringing something or someone else in that doesn't belong. Don't pollute the sacred. And marriage is sacred. And so I entitled this message Marriage Pollution, because what adultery does is it brings another party into an exclusive relationship. It brings in a third party that does not belong in the sacred relationship. And I think when we talk about adultery, we do focus on the physical intimacy of adultery, but we also need to watch out for the emotional intimacy. See, adultery is two kinds of intimacies. You've got physical and emotional. And I think it's important to point out that it's okay to have opposite gender friendships. That's okay. It's a healthy thing. It's not forbidden. But we just have to be really careful with our boundaries. Our physical boundaries and our emotional boundaries. Those two go hand in hand, and we need to be careful. Again, it's totally okay to have opposite gender friendships, but it's easy to fool ourselves when we start to push the boundaries. Oh, that's just harmless flirting. Are you sure? We deceive ourselves really easily, and we start crossing boundaries and rationalizing, and we need to be on our guard and protect our marriage. Again, there are relationships we have as friendships, and then there are relationships we have with our spouse. And those two things are two different things, and we should not blend the borders. I find it interesting, the emotion in the language of Hosea chapter 11, where God says, I was the one who led you out of Egypt. I loved you. I was the one who led you with cords of human kindness. It was me, God says. And then he grieves because the people blew him off. And that I find that interesting because in interacting with spouses who've been cheated on, I've seen that emotion. I was the one who was there. I'm the one who's made a commitment to my spouse. I've been there through the thick and thin, through the good and the bad. How can they just blow me off? And the reason why that's so painful because the relationship is so valuable. It's sacred. We've lost that. There are a lot of things in this world that are a dime a dozen. Marriages are not. I also find it interesting, God's emotion about, hey, look, choose them or choose me. If you want to worship the other gods, then leave me out. But you don't get the benefits of me being your God then. Choose. And that's another emotion I see in spouses who have been cheated on. Look, I want them to choose me. But they've got to choose me or the other. I have yet to run into a spouse who says, well, if they choose both, that's okay. I have not run into those. I'm sure people are out there like that. I have never run into someone. The emotion is always, first, I want them to choose me. I want them to come back to me. But the second emotion is, if they don't come back to me, then we're done. We're not having this both. That's not how sacred relationships work. Jesus then brings up something called adultery in the heart, or of the heart. And interestingly enough, because sometimes you think, well, what was Jesus just making stuff up as he goes? Where does he get this? Well, adultery of the heart does the same thing adultery does. It brings another party into an exclusive relationship that doesn't belong. Now, if you were to ask me which is worse, adultery or adultery of the heart, I would say adultery. But adultery of the heart does the same. It brings in another party and it pollutes the marriage. Now, it says in Matthew 5:27-28, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And I just want to clarify what looking at a woman lustfully is not. It's not natural attraction. There are some people that we just naturally find attractive. And I can naturally find somebody attractive without doing what adultery of the heart is, which is harboring a desire for an illicit relationship. Just because I find someone attractive doesn't mean I'm harboring this desire for an illicit relationship. But when you harbor this desire in your heart and in your mind, you are polluting your marriage. And guys, I can't get around this. I cannot think of a better example of harboring a desire for an illicit relationship than pornography. I can't get around it. And I'm assuming many of you have heard the stats of how prevalent it is. And guys, I understand if you get a little restless in your seat, because I'm up here and I'm a little restless, okay? But pornography leads us down an ugly path. Because those images don't belong there. And they don't just go away. And these unhealthy fantasies grow. And it pollutes our marriages. Now, I don't know what you have to do to get around this, guys, because this is tough on us. I get that. So I don't know what steps you need to take. If you need to talk to someone, if you need accountability, I don't know. But whatever it is you got to do it. For me, I don't have access to a computer that I don't know someone else has access to. I don't have a computer that only I use. All of my computers that I use, whether at church here or at home, other people have access to. I also make sure that even though I have cable, that there are certain channels I don't get. And I'm not just talking about the really naughty ones. There are certain movie channels that I have to avoid because of certain shows that will pop up there. And that's what I need to do. I can't have that. Those images don't belong in our marriages. Now, gals, I understand that sometimes, every now and then, your guy doesn't really measure up romantically. Okay? And that there are other guys who maybe pay a little bit more attention to you or compliment you or say nice things to you or whatever. Or maybe you, from things that you read, you get these romantic ideas of what, relationships should be like. Well, it should be like this or it should be like that. I really don't know how all that works, quite honestly. Just ask my wife. Yeah, he doesn't get it. Yeah. Okay. And maybe your knight in shining armor has, turned into a bucket of bolts. I have no idea. But brothers and sisters, we can invest and sacrifice for our fantasy relationships or we can invest and sacrifice for our sacred relationships. And if you think about it, the choice is obvious. Now, it's not always easy to do, but really, come on. You're going to sacrifice your sacred relationship for your fantasy one? That's not a good choice. I get it, I understand it, but it's a bad choice. And both adultery and adultery of the heart pollute our sacred relationships. But if we're not supposed to pollute our sacred relationships, well, we certainly then, obviously, should be honoring marriage. It must be honored. And it's an understatement to say that marriage in our culture is about as undervalued as it's ever been. We all get that. But that just because that's the cultural standard doesn't mean that's our standard. For us, marriage is sacred. And so when I talk about honoring marriage, I always fall back on, anytime I do a wedding, I do the same. I only have one wedding message. I don't come up with multiple. I just got one. And so if you've ever seen me do a wedding, the three things I'm about to share with you, if you were paying attention, you'll be, oh yeah, I've heard this before. And if after this, I apologize, you come to a wedding that I do, you're going to hear this again, so I apologize up front. Sorry. But first of all, when we honor marriage, we have to be intentional. And if adultery and adultery of the heart are bad things that pollute, we also need to remember that there are some good things that can distract. And so when we are intentional, we have to be sure that we don't use good things to avoid our marriage. Those good things can be work and hobbies and kids. And again, you need to spend time and sacrifice for your work, hobbies, and kids. I get that. But it's easy to play this game of sort of avoiding some difficult things in my marriage. And I can use work as an excuse, or hobbies as an excuse, or my kids as an excuse, or grandkids as an excuse. But our marriage relationships are choices that we make, not just when we say, I do the day of the wedding, but every day of our married lives. And whether we've been married 1 year or 50 years, our marriage will continue to be determined in part by the choices we make. And so, how will those of us who are married choose to love or not love our spouses today? Or how will we choose to love or not love our spouses this week? Marriage, honoring marriage, is hard. There is no way around it. And sometimes I think we have this idea that, well, because marriage is so good, it's going to be easy. It's not easy, and anyone who's been married for more than, I don't know how long, knows it's not easy. It doesn't take long. But we need to make the effort. Things will have to be sacrificed. Some personal pleasures will have to go. Some particular ambitions or life goals maybe need to go. Hobbies, other interests may just have to disappear. But we need to invest time. And we routinely here at TFRC have some kind of marriage group going on. Right now it's on Wednesday nights. Part of our young family, there's 15 couples in a marriage group trying to work proactively on how they can relate better to their spouse. That takes time and effort. There's other things they could be doing on their Wednesday nights. Marriage retreat every spring around February or March. There's a weekend to remember that we promote here. It happens in Boise. And yeah, that's a weekend away. And I know your weekends are precious. And I know it costs money. And all of that. Or maybe you're to the point that maybe you need to get some counseling. And yeah, I know that counseling can be a little embarrassing and humbling and expensive. But honoring marriage is hard. We need to make the effort. And if we're not, whether we're married or not, we need to be supporting other marriages. It is so easy. It is so easy to bash marriage, the old ball and chain, and my old lady or my old man, whatever. It's the cliches. But Hebrews 13 says marriage should be honored by all. And so whether you're married or not, we need to support other marriages. The culture may not value marriage very much, but we will. And yes, you can empathize with people who are struggling in their marriage because yes, marriage is hard. And yes, marriage can be very frustrating. And yes, their spouse may not be perfect and have some significant flaws. But I want to encourage us to not feed the discontent. And as we listen with a loving ear, find a way to encourage. But look at what you've invested, and look at what you guys got, and look at what this could become, and you can make this work, and maybe you need to try this or this or this, and you may not even have the answer, and you don't need to have the answer, but just to encourage them, hey, this can work. As followers of Christ, we value marriage because it's a sacred relationship. And then we honor marriage because it's worth it. Jesus said, "Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Why? Because there is nothing better in life than living life with someone who loves you unconditionally. And I understand, just want to do a quick qualifier, that for those of you who are not married, you can have people in your life who love you unconditionally even though you're not married. But in the context of what we're talking about here, in marriage, there is nothing better than living life with someone who loves you unconditionally. You will have hard times. But hard times are always better when you have someone who loves you unconditionally with you. And you will have good times. But good times are always better when you have somebody who loves you unconditionally with you. The sacred matters. The sacred is valuable. The sacred is our most prized possession. But what if you've blown it? Well, I want you to know, and again, blown it meaning you've committed adultery. We have forgiveness. There is forgiveness. You may have to begin by confessing to yourself. You see, we can fool ourselves into doing things that, are not right, but, you rationalize and you play around with it in your mind and you justify and that kind of stuff. And sooner or later, as it's described as one son in a parable Jesus told, we need to come to our senses. And we need to confess that sacrificing our marriage for whatever else it is we're polluting it with isn't worth it. And then we need to confess to God. And then the hardest step is confessing to a spouse if we haven't. And I would like to quickly recommend that you get some professional help in how you go about doing that. Don't just blurt it out. Find a counselor or some kind of professional help who can help guide you through that. But wherever you are in your marriage, whether you're in a really good place or you're in a not so good place, it's worth the commitment. It's worth the hard. It's worth the frustration. It's worth the sacrifice. Keep going. There is nothing better than living life with someone who loves you unconditionally. And God wants our marriages to work because God loves sacred relationships. And I always conclude my wedding ceremonies with this, and this isn't always age appropriate because some people aren't going to live this long, but I always say my grandparents were married for 60 years. And my prayer for every marriage is that you will make it to 60 years. We've had people in this church who are like up to 65, 67 or something like that. And again, for some of you, your age may not allow you to make it that far, okay. But my prayer for you is, for every marriage in this room, is that however long God gives you on this earth, that you'll be able to look at each other one day, and maybe it's after 60 years, and you can look at each other and say, you know something? I love you more than I ever have. See, that's what sacred relationships do, is they just continue to grow in the love and commitment they have to each other. And my prayer and hope for everyone that's married in this room is that you grow old together.